we are going to we do these things in our in our compulsory course that we know socially in our PhD thing. So we have today Professor SonyaSurabhiGupta, who teaches at Latin American Studies in the Department of Foreign Languages at Jamia. Her research interests focus on knowledge flows in the global south, special reference to Latin America and India in a cross-cultural context. And her most recent publications include Decolonizing Development, Laboratory Epistemologies from India and Latin America, Repressed, and Subalternities in India and Latin America, Dalit Autobiographies and the Testimonio, again Repressed. An edited volume titled Connected History, Shared Present, Cross-Cultural Experiences between Latin America, Caribbean and India is forthcoming. She has also translated into Hindi important work by Spanish and Latin American writers like Garcia Marquez, Rodolfo Walsh, Carlos Fuentes, among others. And institutionally, apart from the academic work and the huge work that she has done, she is the one who was the key architect of Spanish and Latin American studies in India at the institutional level. In 1987, she established Center for Hispanic Studies in what was then, I think it was then not an university. It was CF, Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages, which is now a university. It's called now English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad, which she headed till 2006, when she was then invited by Jamia to set up the Center for Spanish and Latin American Studies, and she was the founding director of that. So, on all accounts, administratively as well as academically, thank you so much for agreeing. We will follow the same thing. She will speak for 45 minutes and then we will have our discussion. Over to you.
Thanks. So, I'd like to go there.
Yeah.
So, I'm really happy to be here. I haven't visited this campus a long time back. I have gone to the other one. Yeah, so it's always good to come to a department which is fine. My background is literature and culture studies, so I mean, yeah, but the kind of work which we are doing now is so interdisciplinary that perhaps you'll find interesting what I have to say. And what I'm dealing today is with 3 autobiographical texts, and they are from the Caribbean. So I'm calling them subaltern narrative, but they can be a question mark as to whether these texts can be called subaltern, and I'll say why. And I'm using this, so I'm calling these autobiographical texts. These are first-person accounts of slaves and indentured laborers in the Caribbean, and I'm calling them Testimonio, which is a typical, very Latin American genre, which came up in the 1970s. So, I have been working on Latin America, and we often take Latin America as also including the Caribbean. But of course, as you all know, the Caribbean is diverse. There's a Francophone Caribbean, there's an Anglophone Caribbean, and there's a Hispanophone Caribbean. I mean, there are all kinds of people, the Dutch who came. So basically, the Caribbean has been a site of numerous diasporas, which filled the labor needs of colonizing empires. You had French coming in, Dutch coming in, and so on and so forth. And uprooted from their culture and from their geography, the slaves and the Indian indentured, African slaves and the Indian indentured, they were of course also from China and nationalities, but they've left us their accounts, they've left us their songs, their diaries, their autobiographies that kind of recount the racialized labor regime, and at the same time these accounts also kind of contain the collective memory. They kind of memorialize their experience, their lived experience of adaptation, of accommodation, of reinventing their identities, of resistance. So there are very few of these accounts, which I'm calling, of course, subaltern accounts, from the Caribbean, and in fact, there are hardly any slave accounts from the entire Latin America, because Latin America was one big site, particularly in Brazil, where a whole lot of slaves were brought in from Africa, from the western coast of Africa. So we have very few accounts, and these have provided valuable sources to the historians to kind of move beyond official historiography, which of course was based on records, census, and diaries, which the supervisors would fill, and so on and so forth. So basically, this historiography of slavery and indentured labor, until very recently, has been dominated by the view of the imperial and the colonial ruling classes, given that the sources were just so very few. But we do have now these material traces left behind by imperial biopolitics, not only in the form of these abundant colonial records, but also of the voice of the colonized subjects themselves. So today what I'm going to do is, I'm going to, so before I begin, I would like to, of course, say that the Caribbean, has been a site of various diasporas. I'm sure you have heard of the transatlantic slave trade, which took place soon after 1492. So this is the age of discovery and exploration. 1492, Christopher Columbus reaches the Caribbean, thinks he has reached India, and which is why, I hope you know that little bit of that history, but just to remind you that the transatlantic slave trade, so basically why do we call it the transatlantic slave trade? Because it was mainly the British, they were the biggest slave traders. So they would come to the Western Africa, they would come to Africa, sell gunpowder, several products to the African elite, the chieftains, etc. And from there, not just buying, but actually kidnapping. First, what we call human trafficking, that took place, and through these ships, which were literally prisons on waters. So the seas became that middle passage that you know about. So all these people reached the Caribbean and the mainland, the continent, the Latin American continent, and which was, of course, inhabited by people. It's not as though it was empty land and therefore there was need to fill. I think I'll have to kind of recount the fact that in 1492, when Christopher Columbus reaches there were big civilizations there. The Aztecs, when the Spanish conquistadors reached Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and which is where Mexico City today, the capital of Mexico, is located. Goodness, I'm sorry. I'm in the lecture. Sorry, I just put this on. Yeah, so there were these indigenous people living there, the Aztecs, the Mayas, the Incas in Peru, but they were decimated. It was literally a genocide, also because of the disease that was brought by the European smallpox. There's a description of how the Tenochtitlan, which was a magnificent city, the canals were full of cadavers because of people having died from smallpox. So the fact that the colonizers needed land, which they had in plenty, but they needed labor, which necessitated the Atlantic slave trade. So you needed slaves to work in the mines, in the plantations, and that is why this huge amount of people who were brought in from Africa. So this is from the 16th to the 19th century. And this is the triangular trade in which arms, textiles, wine, etc. were shipped from Europe to Africa. From Africa, the slaves were taken to the Americas, and from the Americas, the cotton, sugar, tobacco, and coffee, etc. would go to Europe. Sugar, for example, became an addiction in Europe, at that time. And if there's this wonderful book by Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, which recounts that the entire industrial revolution, the British, the English Industrial Revolution actually took place on the back of slave labor. You think of banking, you think of insurance, you think of fisheries, you think of the invention of the steam engine by James Watt. So it is all done with money, which was, you know, I mean, it's a fascinating account, this book by Eric William, who was the first premier of Trinidad and Tobago. And this was his PhD thesis. I'm talking about way back in 1940s, the book comes out. So this is the Atlantic slave trade. And then you have the indentured labor, because when slavery is abolished, you know that in the 1830s slavery is abolished. But after the, however, the imperial labor needs are still there. So that is why we have these indentured labor. You know about them perhaps, that several of the UP, Bihar, you know, our ancestors went there, and you know, the British, particularly to the British ruled Caribbean, including South America, Trinidad, Guyana, and so on and so forth. So this is the, so these are the texts that I'm going to deal with today. So what I'm going to do is kind of juxtapose these three autobiographical works from the Caribbean. As I said, these are first-hand accounts of plantation laborers from the Caribbean region. So we will revisit one of the founding texts of what is the Latin American genre of Testimonio, and it is called Biografía de un Cimarrón, or the autobiography of a runaway slave. I'll come to the details later, but just to tell you that it is the life story of a 106-year-old former slave from Cuba. His name was Esteban Montejo, and it is his life story as narrated to and as compiled by an ethnologist, a Cuban ethnologist called Miguel Barnett. So this is supposed to be the first documentary novel. For those of you who are fond of reading, many of you know that there is this novel by Truman Capote, In Cold Blood, which comes out in the 1960s, is considered the first documentary novel. But actually, way back, you know, you already have this account, the autobiography of a runaway slave. And yeah, the second text that I'm going to be dealing with is Damra Bhal Bahar. Sorry. How do I get back to? Yeah. How do I come here?
Bottom left.
Sorry?
Bottom left.
Bottom?
Left bottom left.
Here. No. This? Ah, right. No, so I need to go back to the texts. One. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So this one is Damra Bhal Bahar. This of course is in Hindi, Awadhi, and so on and so forth. And very recently, the English translation came out. This particular book, of course, is from 1916. It's as old as it was published first in 1916. It was written in Guyana, what is today Guyana, but only very recently in 2019 has the first English translation come out. So this book is by Lali Hari Sharma, who began his Caribbean Odyssey as an indentured labor in Demerara. So Damra is there, Demerara, and he of course prospered there on to become a big rice farmer and a politician. So the book is written in this vernacular bridge and Awadhi of North India. The text is a collection of holy songs, but it kind of also has the indentured life, you know, woven into these holy songs that are even today performed by the Indian diaspora in Guyana. The third text I am taking is Munshi Rahman Khan's Jeevan Prakash, or the autobiography of an Indian indentured labourer. This came out in 2005. So it's again an autobiographical narrative written in Hindi, and it covers Munshi Rahman Khan's early life in India, and then his indentureship in Suriname, which is, as you know, was a Dutch colony. And so he's first a contract labourer, and then he becomes an independent agriculturist, and is recognized as a man of letters among the community of diasporic Indians in Suriname. So arising from the experiences of these three men in the, from Cuba, Guyana, Suriname, which we can say are three sites in the Caribbean with a long history of slavery and indenture, these texts are actually from the very limited corpus of autobiographical works that I told you are available today, and therefore they give us an insight into the kind of inner affective world of these transplanted humans whose sweat and blood is the stuff history is made of. So, so I read these texts in the framework of an archipelagic thought. So, yeah, so this of course is very fashionable today, but actually has an old history. So I don't know if in sociology you talk about archipelagic thinking, but it is a theoretical concept that has been increasingly deployed by historians, social scientists, literary and cultural studies scholars, particularly since about, say, 1950s. If you look at the term, the archipelago is actually it designated the islands in the Aegean waters, near Greece and Turkey. But after the Europe's age of discovery and these voyages of exploration, the term, when you had, so it came to kind of identify any set of islands. So for example, Philippines is an archipelago, Japan is an archipelago, even England is an archipelago, because it's a set of islands. So now archipelago of course is a topographical unit, but beyond this geographical materiality, beyond this topography, from the 1950s onwards, new meanings and theorization of the archipelago have been coming out, particularly from the newly liberated world. Yeah. So, for example, from the Indo-Pacific Ocean, but also from the Atlantic, from Caribbean particularly. And I, of course, only talk about the Caribbean, which has been a major center for archipelagic theorization and practice. So, several Caribbean intellectuals, I've just got a few here, they've kind of mobilized the archipelago as an analytical framework for for disrupting this notion of islandness, of insularity. Because when you think of an island, you think of something which is insular. This is the continent, the mainland, which has got all the networks and so on and so forth. So, but in order to disrupt this idea of insularity and for thinking beyond kind of national paradigms, these Caribbean thinkers, for example, Trinidadian C.L.R. James, he has written this major book called The Black Jacobins on the Haitian Revolution. In fact, I always tell my students that it is one of the most important books, because the Haitian Revolution was, Haiti is supposed to be such a small country, always in crisis. You only hear of Haiti and, that there's an economic crisis, and, but the fact is that one of the first successful slave rebellions which led to independence of a colony, that is Haiti, happened in Haiti. It was the first, and therefore C.L.R. James worked on it, and the book is called The Black Jacobins, the Haitian Revolution. Of course, he wrote a lot about it, but he was also advocating for the Federation of British West Indies, precisely saying that these islands are not, they are fragments, but there is interconnection. I mean, today you think of West Indies, till very long back, I always thought of West Indies as one country. It's only, when you watch cricket, and then you realize that it's actually a confederation of several small, particularly British colonies. But the West Indies, the term itself actually refers to all the islands, when you think of West Indies. So, I can't go into those details, but the fact that the idea of West Indies came because Columbus thought that he had reached India. So he called it the Indies. But when it was a few years later, he died. He died in 1503, thinking that he had actually discovered a new route to India. But it's when other conquistadors and other navigators come, they realize that no, there's not only these islands, there's a mainland, and this is not Japan, this is not Asia, this is not India, this is a new world. So the so-called discovery of the new world. So at that time, you had these two Indies, the East Indies and the West Indies. So the West Indies referred to all these islands, and C.L.R. James basically talks about how they are culturally interrelated units. Similarly, you have Sylvia Winter, who also theorizes the Caribbean not as being composed of isolated islands, but as an interconnected archipelago. So, and she has described the entire Caribbean as an ex-slave labor archipelago, as an ex-slave they were archipelago. So instead of a geographical definition, she has this definition of the Caribbean. Again, we have Edouard Glissant. He was actually, he would have got the Nobel Prize, but it went to another Caribbean writer, Derek Belcourt, in 1992. So Edouard Glissant is actually the person who's most associated with archipelagic thinking, and he also insists on this interconnectedness, and he rejects this idea of the island being insular and the islandness, isolation and uniformity. So he is the one who formulated the concept of archipelagic thinking. So the archipelagic thinking is this alternative which is pivoted on the concept of relation. So basically archipelagic thinking, it kind of draws metaphorically from this geography, of the Caribbean archipelago, fragmented yet interconnected islands, but basically it proposes a model of thought which privileges a poetics of relation. What does a poetics of relation mean? That, it privileges the values of diversity, multiplicity, relationality. So, for example, in Glissant's vision, identities are not fixed. Identities are not singular. Identities are relational. They are formed in contact with others. Right? So, also culture, like islands, can remain distinct while still being in dialogue with each other. Yeah, so these are some of the insights which Glissant actually had put forth. And so archipelagic thinking underpins this poetics of relation, which Glissant talked about, as a way of understanding the entire world, not just the Caribbean and the archipelago there, but as an understanding the entire world, emphasizing the interdependence and not demanding sameness. Right? So basically what they were saying is that the world is not composed of hierarchies but of constellations. So while the island mainland kind of connection establishes a hierarchy, with the continent being the hegemon, here in this case, the emphasis on interconnectedness and looking at the world as an archipelago of interconnected identities is something which comes up in the 1990s through the Caribbean through the Caribbean thought. And so basically we find that there is this call for decontinentalizing. So this decontinentalizing framework, which would kind of emphasize lateral relationships, lateral interconnected relationships between sites in which alternative practices are emerging. So basically, informed by this kind of an archipelagic approach, this is what they have said. So I'm going to talk about this testimonio, this particular genre in which we are going to look at these autobiographies as a shared Caribbean aesthetic of, the testimonio as an archipelagic memory. Now let me just tell you what I mean by this. So basically what I'm doing is that I'm going to read these texts in the framework of testimonio, this Latin American Caribbean genre. I will first try to tell you how the literary form of each book was and and also highlight the collaborative nature of their production, their publication, and I look at these texts also as emancipatory acts. That they were emancipatory acts that kind of affirm the selfhood of the narrators, of these first-person narrators, and so these three books are very difficult to define. You saw that one is the autobiography of a slave. It's called an autobiography, but actually it is a compilation of his recorded history by an ethnologist. So there are two people involved. There is the ethnologist who's actually written, but he could not have written it but for the interviews, the series of interviews he took with this ex-slave. So the collaborative nature of the production of the text is a distinctive feature of the testimonio, and So what I'm saying is that let me take a minute explaining what I think I've got a slide on that. Yeah, so I'm taking a minute explaining what a testimonio is. So in the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, there is this very famous literature house in Havana. It's called Casa de las Americas, the House of Americas. And the Casa de las Americas used to give literary prizes. So they had novel, you had poetry, and you had theatre. They also had essay, because essay has a long tradition in Latin America. But in the 60s and 70s, they started getting a kind of writing which was neither novel, nor poetry, nor theatre, nor essay. And these were the accounts of guerrilla fighters who had gone to exile, because 60s, and 70s in Latin America were days of guerrilla fight. 1959 is the Cuban Revolution. So this new kind of writing which was literary and yet it was non-fiction. So when the jury said, what do we do with this? And that is when they felt the need of thinking of a new literary form, and that's when the testimonio actually, so 1970 a new genre and these first person accounts, so testimonio can be an interview, long interview. So it's a very interesting genre. Yeah, so as you can see, the term is used in literary and cultural studies to refer to a narration marked by the urgency to make public a situation of oppression or injustice and or resistance against the same condition. So normally there are collective subjects. So have you heard of Rigoberta Menchú? She's the 1992 Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize. 1992 Peace Prize. Now she, for example, from Guatemala, she was an indigenous woman whose entire family was, killed and so on and so forth. And she gave an interview to Elizabeth Burgos, who was I think a British or a US, I don't remember now. Well, and that interview was published in book form. A long interview was published in book form. So again, so you see there is a narrator and then there is either a journalist or a lettered person, because this person doesn't know how to write, perhaps. For example, Esteban Montejo did not know how to write, the slave. He did not know how to write, but so this kind of a collaborative effort is the defining feature of testimonio. That's the defining feature. So the testimonio as a genre has been associated with the historical context of 60s and 70s in Latin America, where it emerged as a new post-fictional form of literature in which narratives of self-representation of former slaves, indigenous people, political activists, guerrilla combatants, unlettered women took shape. Yeah. So these were translated by 1980s. In fact, I found when I did my research that there were several translations of minor women from Sandino's daughters, for example, from Nicaragua, in Telugu, in Tamil. Because I spent a lot of time in Hyderabad, and in Hindi also I found. Madhya Pradesh, there was a small women's collective which had translated some. So they were traveling, these accounts were traveling, without the intermediation of the academia. So it's very interesting, this form of the testimonial, the genre itself. Yeah, so what binds them together, what binds these three texts together is the fact that they kind of talk about the structure of the Caribbean, and that structure of the Caribbean which was harnessed to sugar and slavery. So it's the symbiosis of sugar and servitude which we find in all these accounts. So have you in sociology done Anibal Quijano?
Yes.
Yeah. So you have done Anibal Quijano. So his concept of coloniality of power. One of his major essays, basically he was a Peruvian sociologist, no? And one of the major things that he's arguing is that how colonialism and modernity are two sides of the same coin. One. Two, that capitalism is actually racial capitalism. You cannot think of capitalism in any other way but a racialized regime. Yeah. So this idea of coloniality of power of Anibal Khano, so where he draws our attention to the fact that race as a mental category is actually produced in these formative stages of capitalism. I'm going back to 1492, 50s, you know, from the 60s and 70s. Let me see my next slide. Okay. How is it not moving now? No. Somebody have to come and help me. Okay, it's going back to. Just tell me what you know how to do here. Yeah, so what Anibal Khano has said is that the idea of race was deployed to give legitimacy to these to this unpaid labor, you know. Yeah, it is this one actually. Yeah, yeah, we'll come to that. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the next one. So we are here. Yeah. Okay, so basically what does Anibal Khano say? When he draws our attention to the fact that actually it was during these formative stages of capitalism that the idea of race was codified. So first it was applied to the indigenous people, then it was applied to the Africans, and then at a global level it would be applied to yellow, green or whatever color, brown or whatever color, you know, which are now. So this is a very important insight that we have, and so these first-hand accounts of slavery and servitude in the Caribbean region, because it was the first region which saw this influx in the 16th century. That is why they are important, because they kind of offer an epistemological critique of this imperial enterprise. In India, we have kind of this generic configuration of the Latin American Testimonio has been used for studying the rich corpus of Dalit life writings, in order to differentiate them from the genre of autobiography, which is normally associated with first-person accounts of important men, perhaps also important women. So critics have used the term testimonio to, for example, M.S.S. Pandian. He uses the term testimonio to talk about, I don't know if you've heard of Bama. Have you heard of Bama? So she is a Tamil writer of great renown in India, and she has this book called Karaku. It's a very small volume, you should read it. Karaku is the palm leaf, and she talks about, so M.S.S. Pandian said this is a testimonial. So, in fact, this is the book which I had edited, and precisely to look at why the Dalit autobiography has been read as testimonial. So, for example, Sharmila Rege, I'm sure you're familiar with her work. Sharmila Rege has this book called Writing Caste, what is it called? Writing Caste, Writing Gender, Testimonials of Dalit Women, something like that. Yeah. The subtitle.
Yeah, I just remember the first part.
Yeah. So writing caste, writing gender, Dalit women's testimonial. And so several sociologists in India, several M.S.S. Pandian again, I think he's a sociologist, no? He worked. So several people have used the genre of testimonial to talk about particularly Dalit women's autobiography. Right? So So also the indenture history, the oral narrative of the indentured people, even to study them, Indian academicians have used the genre of testimony. For example, Vijay Mishra has this essay called Writing Indenture History Through Testimonials and Oral Narratives, and he calls attention to the few surviving written testimonials, written accounts that give the contemporary accounts of subaltern life worlds of the indentured laborers. And he doesn't discuss these two texts, he discusses another text which is called, which is in Hindi's Fiji Dweep mein mere 21 varsh. And in English it would be My 21 Years in Fiji Islands. It came out in 2003. and it is the Testimonio of Totaram Sanagia, who was an indentured labor, which has a typical characteristic of a testimonio. It was compiled by somebody called Banarsidas Chaturvedi and published, I think it was published in Bombay. And it is a graphic account of the indentured life in Fiji, not in the Caribbean. So, one of the major characteristics, as I have been saying, now I've become scared of this, that if I do it too hard. No. So, is mediation and collaboration. This is a key feature of these three texts. So, for example, the manuscript of Lal Bihari Sharma, Dabra Khar Bahar, which I was telling you, the songs of Demerara. It's very interesting. It travelled in 1916 from British Guyana to Bombay. Okay, and in 1960, this Sri Venkateshwar Press of Bombay, it published. It was supposed to be one of the most important publishers of that time. It specialized in Hindi and Sanskrit texts. And this text would have been lost to history. But for the painstaking effort of a labor historian called Gayatra Bahadur, who's got a wonderful book called The Coolie Woman. And during her research on indentured women, she came across this book. And she came across this labor historian, Prabhu Mohapatra from Delhi University, who mentioned this text to her. And she tried to locate it. It was very difficult to get it. She found it in some godown of a library in Britain. And she got a clandestine copy. Because the clerk there somehow, scanned it, and she got a clandestine copy of this book, thanks to that archivist in the library who found it. Yeah, so it's the warehouse of a library at Yorkshire, and she made this digital copy for her. But the fact was that it was in Hindi, and Gayatra Bahadur did not know Hindi, so through a translation, oral translation, etc., she used it for her work. But it was only in 2019 that Rajiv Mohabir actually translated these songs and put this beautiful, mediation and collaboration. No, this one. Again, the same. Yeah. So this book, Dabra Khar Bahar of 1916, comes out in 2019 in an English translation for the first time. After more than a century. Yeah? And it's got a lovely title, I Even Regret the Night, which is a verse from his. And the last book, as I told you, is Munshi Mehman Khan, this Jeevan Prakash. This again has this wonderful history of collaboration and the way it came out. So, for example, even this book, by the way, this book was, the manuscript is in Hindi, but till date, the Hindi version is not published. Munshi Mehman Khan's Jeevan Prakash was written in Hindi. So it first came out in a Dutch translation because he was in Dutch Suriname, he was in Dutch Guyana, Suriname. So some Dutch historians translated it into Dutch, and from there it was translated into English. The Hindi original is still to be published. So this is what I was trying to. I don't want to go into more details. That it's been nearly 50 years. But despite being one of the rare documents that provides insight, particularly into the Hindu-Muslim relationship in the Indo-Caribbean diaspora, we find that this book is still not available to read. As far as Montefo's Testimonio is concerned, this came out in 1960s. It's again got a very interesting story. It seems that Fidel Castro was giving a lecture and he was talking to some intellectuals, and that Cuba had a very, very successful literacy campaign. So there were still some surviving slaves. These were the runaway slaves who had run away. The Marronage was a great phenomenon during the slaves used to run away and then organize rebellions and resistance and so on and so forth. So there were about 6 runaway slaves, most of them about 100 years old, 103 years old, nearly 100 years old, who were still alive. And so Fidel said that if they learn how to read and write, perhaps they can tell us their stories. So they were part of the literacy campaign, these. But this Miguel Barnett, as a young ethnologist, decided to actually have taped interviews with Esteban Montefo. When they started, he was 103 years old. By the time they finished 3 years later, he was 106 years old. And this particular document, the biography of a runaway slave, the autobiography of a runaway slave, therefore, is such an important document because, yeah, it's the history of the people without history. No? Those people who we think don't have history. Yeah, so, right, this book of course is a super seller. It's got 70 editions, translations into various languages and so on and so forth. So what becomes clear from this mapping of the three texts is the manner in which they have come to us. Through collaboration and, so this, the fact that today we have this opportunity to have a kind of a, window into the inner world of the slaves and of the indentured labor is thanks to their subjectivities, thanks to these collaborative efforts. So I now come to the last point that I'm making, and that is how these autobiographies actually are emancipatory acts. Because another feature that these autobiographical narratives share is that they are fashioned as chronicles of becoming, because these are people who are not great men or anything. So the becoming of a subject, so that is how all these three texts are fashioned. And so the narratives move from the condition of subjugation, how they travel, their interoceanic travels, the conditions of subjugation, and to the assertion of their subjecthood and their agency. So for example, in this seminal book by Paul Gilroy, The Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy has said that the black autobiography, and I'm citing him, becomes an act or process of simultaneous self-creation and self-emancipation. And I think this can equally be applied to the life writings of the Indian indentured laborers, because although they are singular experiential accounts of these three individuals, they delineate the texture of life under slavery or under indenture, and simultaneously they are also history. So they are sociology, they are literature, they are history, because they kind of have a record of the epochal events of their times. So after slavery was established, it is from the rank and file of these indentured laborers that the empire would fill its coffers. No? So people say that servitude is different from slavery, but the fact is that as far as both of them are concerned, narrating their selves becomes an emancipatory act, and the form that the narration takes place is distinct in each case. So we're not looking for sameness, but what we are looking for is this interrelatedness, which the archetypal thinking kind of thought makes it, that kind of approach facilitates it. So, for example, John Beverley gives one key feature of the genre of testimonio, and he says, and I'm citing, testimonio is not so much concerned with the life of a problematic hero. The problematic hero is the term which Lukács uses for talking about the nature of the hero in the bourgeois novel. So he says that the testimonio is more about the problematic collective social situation that the narrator lives with or alongside others. So, of course, biography of a runaway slave, or actually there are two translations. So, autobiography or the biography of a runaway slave, as I said, is a founding text, and what I'll do is I'll just finish up quickly by giving you small excerpts from these books, because otherwise it's like talking. How do we go to the next one? Scroll. Yeah. So if you can, can't we get a full screen? Okay. So, yeah.
This side 40.
You must have.
No, I just want to. Yeah. No, we got this. Okay. So try. Yeah. So, yeah, this is it. So I put in just a small paragraph from each of the three texts so that you know what they are talking about. So for example, in the biography of a runaway slave, I just cited the text, it says, I see many of the horrors of punishment during slavery. That's why I didn't like that life. The cruelest were the stocks that they kept in the boiler house. They were stand-up stocks and lying down ones. You know what these stocks are? They were like wooden frames, wooden. They were stand-up stocks and the lying down ones. They were made of thick planks with holes, where they made the slave put his feet, his hands and his head. They were locked up like that for 2 or 3 months for any kind of simple bad behavior. They use the leather on the pregnant women too, but they lay them face down over a scooped out piece in the ground. So they make them lay down, the face down over a scooped out piece of the ground to protect their bellies. So these are pregnant women. The women got a whole handful of lashes. Well, they tried not to damage the babies because they wanted them in abandonment. So this kind of commodification of the human life, he doesn't have any theoretical insights about what we're talking about, but the fact that the bellies of the pregnant women were protected even then when they were under the lash, because he wanted the baby because he would be the next slave. Yeah, so I really found this. There are several. Of course, it's not just about victimhood. He also talks about how he ran away. He's so proud of being of a runaway maroon. And it's a storehouse of 19th century folk songs, traditions, everything. Which comes in the entire book. Yeah. Then we have next one. Yeah. Yeah. This is the Damra Khag Bahar. So he is not Chaupai. You know what a Chaupai is? A Chaupai is like a char, it comes from four, and like a four verse composition in Hindi. If you've done some Hindi literature, some of you may have done it. They tell you Doha and Chaupai. Doha is like the Ramayana, Ramcharitmanas rather, is written in Doha and Chaupai. So those are the forms he uses. So he says, everybody doesn't understand Hindi here, but I'd like to still read it, though I have an English translation there. So it says that Likhan chaho kuch damra riti, Likhan chaho kuch damra riti, suni hai sajjan kari priti, ye hai desh udesh apara, rahat na dharma vivek vichara, desh chhadikar damra aayi. I left my home and I came to Damra. Desh chhadike damra aayi, apar naam so kuli likha hai. I was a kuli. I registered my name as a kuli. They were called coolies, the Indian indentured labor. So they say, apna naam so kuli likha hai, bhajan chhadi chhad nij dharma. So it was also considered that if you had crossed the 7 seas, you had lost your caste. So the transoceanic void was actually an equalizer. So whether you were a Dalit, whether you were a Brahmin, you finally, had lost your caste. So by the time you reached the Caribbean, that's what he says. Bhajan chhadi chhad nij dharma, chhadi vedikat karahi ko karma, nitya karm jo damra mahi, so ab likho kabit ke mahi. So now I'm going to write my routine life in Damra in the form of verse. So he just says, I want to write a little. This is Mahabir's translation. I want to write a little of Demerara's customs. Listen, this is a country of infinite ills, where wisdom is scarce. I left my home and I came to Demerara, my name penned as Kuli, forsaking bhajans, forsaking dharma. The Vedas I abandoned to my disgrace. Of the routines of Demerara life, I write this kavit, these verses. Yeah. So, and then, how do I get this? Yeah. So, this is a small fragment from Munshi Rahman Khan's autobiography, where he's talking about the coming of the Indians to Suriname, how the Indians reached Suriname, and he says, initially the Habshis from Africa, the Negroes were called Habshis, So, yeah, initially the Habshis from Africa were brought to Suriname to work as slaves. Later, on 1st July 1863, they were freed from bondage. 10 years later, that is on 5th June 1873, the first batch of 408 Indian immigrants were brought to Suriname from India by the ship named Lala Ratha. These Indians had come to work on a 5-year contract. So the contract was called an agreement, but since they couldn't pronounce the word agreement, they used to call it girmit. Girmit, and therefore the literature of the of the Girmit is written in Girmitia. It's called the Girmitia literature. And the language, which is Creole, which is mix of Caribbean Creole, is, so he says that, on a 5-year contract, that was the Girmit. I then opened the book. So I got another one. Now, Munshi Rahman Khan's book is so important because it tells us about the Hindu-Muslim relations during indenture. And of course, we are talking about late 19th century, beginning of 20th century. So he says that he reaches there, and the Dalits, of course, so there's a Panditji who says, okay, let's get the new Indians who have come. So the people who have organized the, what is it called, the bhajan gathering, the bhajan where they're singing the songs, etc. They say, no, this time it's only Dalits and the Muslims. So the Panditji said, no, get them anyways. So they reach there, and Panditji realizes that people did not know how to read the Ramayana. And here you had Munshi Rahman Khan who offers to read the Ramayana. He was not being allowed to touch it, but Panditji says, no, let him read it. And that is why he's a Munshi, because he was a Pandit himself. He knew the Ramayana so well. And he became, therefore, the key person for the recitation of Ramayana in these gatherings of the Indian diaspora. He talks about this experience. That is what he says, and I'll tell you more. So he says, I then opened the book and asked Panditji which portion to read. Read about Ramchandraji's marriage, he replied. All right, I said, I shall read the Chaupai and you explain. Yet Panditji asked me to do both the things. When I began my reading and explanation, everyone present there was surprised. Panditji praised my Guru for teaching me so nicely. For 3 hours in a row, I read the Ramayana and everybody sat silently during the whole period. But he also recounts how in the beginning of the 20th century, the Arya Samaj comes. There's a boycott of Muslims and their products in the diaspora, in Suriname, in Guyana and everywhere. And how finally, these Hindu-Muslim relations actually for nearly a decade were soured till, I think Gandhiji's intervention. And so I'll just say one more thing about Munshi Rahman Khan's thing, So by the way, these people who traveled together were called Jahaji Bhai. Jahaji means ship, Bhai means brother, the ship brothers. And there were a lot of women. And that, of course, is such a fascinating story. I haven't dealt with any of the women in venture. So towards the end he says, and I'd like to read this, I haven't put it there. So he says that it took 10 long years for this discord to end. And it came to an end in 1943, this discord between Hindus and Muslims. And Rahman Khan writes of this moment when the discord comes to an end, this moment of reconciliation. And I'm citing from the book, he says, today I would like to thank the formless Lord of all forms, the Brahma, on behalf of the Hindus and Muslims for his creations. He finally performed his duty of conservation. Vishnu as that of conservation. I was surprised to read this because here is a devout Muslim who offers his namaz 5 times, mentions, who offers his namaz 5 times a day, and yet he's so familiar with the Hindu scriptures and he thanks the Hindu gods for finally having, thanks Vishnu and Brahma for having brought this moment of reconciliation. So I think I will just kind of finish by, conclude. I'd like to cite Derek Walcott again, he got the Nobel Prize in 1992, and in his Nobel Prize lecture, which is titled The Antilles, Fragments of Epic Memory. So in his acceptance speech, he refers to these complex histories of African and Asian diasporas in the Caribbean as a process of assembling broken pieces. In fact, in that Nobel acceptance speech, he talks about how the Ram Leela is being performed, and so this African and Asian diasporas together have never been read like that. So the Indian diaspora is always looked at as people who are longing to come back to India, as nostalgia. But the shared Caribbean aesthetic, the experience of servitude, of having been basically, commodified labor of a racialized imperial, labor regime, that they were basically filling the coffers with the same masters, all these things are only very new. Very, very recently are these things being talked about in terms of a shared Caribbean identity. Yeah. So the study of Caribbean literature within national borders has led to a kind of balkanization of Caribbean studies. So recently there has been a book brought out by Judith Mishrahi-Bara on these Kalapani crossings. These were called Kalapani crossings. So like the Andaman and Nicobar were called Kalapani. So these were called the Black Waters, the Kalapani crossings. And as a parallel to the Black Atlantic. So you have the Indian Ocean. So Indian Ocean studies, So reading these three Caribbean texts that we have juxtaposed today, and reading them as testimonials, and reading them as interrelated, interconnected, archipelagic memories. We think that this comparative framework not only has helped us to look at the affected world of these three men, they were contemporaries trapped in this unjust order, but it also kind of illuminates the process, this mediation, collaboration, production of these life stories, how they have been brought to us from the obscurity of history. In fact, I think it's Gayatri Bahadur who says that but for this mediation, but for this collaborative project, they would have remained not just as footnotes of history, but to become texts, but come out of that, it has required so much work. The extraordinary power of these stories, of course, one, it lies in the stories that they're narrating, but I think also in the resilience of the texts themselves, that they have fought hard to come to us. And they were lost. And so it's also the resilience not only of the men and women, but also the resilience of the texts themselves that I think is a common feature of these, so that we know that, the stories of these men and women. So my last, the last one I can get. Sorry, I was not able to get your. Yeah, no. Yeah. So I just finished, this is the last slide, and I finished with this quote from Barnett's introduction to the autobiography of the runaway slave, and he says, "The life of men of so-called culture of poverty doesn't always lack the will to exist, or lack a consciousness of history. And even when such a life is anchored in a sense of marginality, the flame of that life glows towards the future." And I was really caught at the fact that the flame of life that Barnett is talking about is the flame of life, perhaps, which Munshi Rahman Khan has put as the title of his autobiography, Jeevan Prakash. And it is these flames of life, these flames, these which kind of kindles our hope for new futures, perhaps even in very dark times. So I'm going to finish there, and if there are any questions, and if we can talk about together, I think that will make it more fruitful. Yeah.
Thank you, Sonya. Now it's open for comments, questions. At sociologist, I was thinking, when you were talking about ethnologists writing, what do we do when we do vis-a-vis the respondents that we go and collect accounts, and so that struck me as something which is very, very interesting. Wherein here are people interviewing those, most of the times when classical anthropology, or even now when we go to field, there will be people who can't write, who do not express themselves. That is one thing which really struck. And the other thing was this interconnectedness I was thinking, wherein one is talking about hierarchy and relationship. So hierarchy also has an interrelationship, doesn't it? Which is, so I was also thinking about that. It's a relationship of a different kind. It can be of a different kind, but there is a relationship which exists out there.
Yeah.
But anyhow, it's open to all of it.
Well, that has been actually a big debate in the Testimonio studies. The poetics of relation, or the relationship between the transcriber and the narrator, you know, isn't it a relationship of power?
Yeah.
You know, because here you have an illiterate person, and then you have this person, and then so the whole question of truth, you know, how do we know that what has been transcribed is true, etc. So these questions have arisen, but I think the answer to that is that I think these are lateral relationships, not really hierarchical relationships, because it's just a relationship of solidarity. So Barnett, it's like the translator of a Dalit autobiography. So a Dalit autobiography isn't really a testimonio, because the Dalits have the agency. They write their own. They don't need a Subaltern to write their stories. You know, they write it themselves. And yet, most of the autobiographies by the Dalits are written in their languages. Now we have Dalit autobiographies out in English, but all of them are either in Marathi, or they will be in Gujarati, or they will be in Hindi. And so the translator there plays the key role of the transcriber, the role which the ethnologist has played here of transcribing the oral to the written form, you know, from the oral word to the written. I think in the case of the Dalit autobiography, that same mediation is happening. So what is the relationship between the translator of a Dalit autobiography to the writer? And is it a hierarchical relationship, or is it a lateral relationship?
And also the element of when it is getting transferred, it's something getting lost. How is it getting represented?
Yeah, it could get lost, it could also be. So for example, when Bama's Karuku was translated, she had used Tamil, which was the Tamil of the Dalit quarters. So there was this question as to whether the English translation can actually carry that. But then that's a question with all translations. That's a different question altogether. But that way, even a Tamil Brahmin, would have a different language than the Tamil of the Dalit quarters. And in fact, Lakshmi Holmstrom, the translator, actually mentions this challenge. So I think this whole idea of collaboration, is important, because it's a relationship of solidarity, not really that of power. And when I said the poetics of relation, I think we were talking more about the fact that many times the nation as a category, hides these, the fact that culture has actually been always rhizomatic. What is European modernity without the Arab travelers who took the concept of zero, took the treatise of alchemy, took the treatise on chess, and it all went to Europe, and Europe had its renaissance, not without all these. And it could, in fact, the Latin American scholars say that European modernity is also not possible without the Andean rationality. The New World was discovered. So, so I think the whole idea in Latin American decolonial thought is not to look at modernity as something that has to be contested, and, but rather to look at modernity as transmodernity, which is a product of various cultures. So I think that interconnectedness and that kind of an archipelagic thought, feeds into this kind of decoloniality. Rather than
So we are waiting for that company. So like, this is the first time I've heard of like architecture thought, and I was just curious about how like, so like we can see that it also comes with a colonial legacy, and like if I'm building up from like Eduardo Galliano, so he critiques the idea like whereas architecture thought they will be like they will celebrate that fragmentation,
Yeah.
but Galena, on the other hand, will talk about how like he was very critical of the division of South American states, Latin America, and even a lot of other thinkers also from Latin America, even in that book Motorcycle Diaries, Che Guevara also talks about how like the fragmentation is very artificial and it shouldn't be. And so like I just wanted to ask now, like do you think that the archipelagic thought is at somewhat risk of being absorbed in the liberal capitalist framework, which actually commodifies diversity?
Okay, yeah, so let's take the first part. You are right that in Latin America, the liberators had this continental project. They had a continental project. So, for example, the Latin American unity as against. So, the word Latin America actually, the name Latin America is very new. It comes out in the 1850s precisely as a continental project. As a continental project against an imperial neighbor with its expansionist designs. So, the idea of Latin America is precisely a continental project. To that extent, you are very right in saying that whether it's the liberators of Latin America or whether it's thinkers like Galeano, etc., or whether it's even more recent leaders like Chavez, perhaps, you know, I mean, who always talked about CELAC, who always talked about Bolivarian America, and so on and so forth. Undoubtedly, Latin America as a continental anti-imperialist project is, you know, always preferred to the kind of fragmented map, for example, of Africa, which is a completely artificial map. And it is a product, it is very rightly, as you say, of colonial legacies. But I think here, what is being said is that the fragmentation of the fragmentation here is in sense of diversity, that you don't have to be same. You know, so Clisson is talking about it in the 1990s. CLR James is talking, of course, again a little earlier. But when they are talking about this kind of an archipelagic thought in terms of privileging fragmentation, I think what they are talking about is diversity, you know, plurality, and that also non-linearity. That, you know, basically you can live in a world which is diverse. You can live in a world which may be opaque to you. You know, so I think it comes from, it's more of a post-colonial, therefore decolonial and post-colonial construct, valorizing fragmentation, meaning that you can have like a rhizomatic structure. In fact, Deleuze and Guattari use this whole thing of the rhizome. It is very much there in Edouard Glisson's book, you know, where they talk about rhizomes being this lateral kind of a relationship where fragments can relate to each other without being the same. So that was the idea of the archipelago, and therefore the world can be an archipelago. Now coming to the second point, you know, whether diversity can be commodified. I mean, that danger is always there, you know. I mean, but the fact is that in the face of nativist politics, in the face of particularly in our times when we're talking about pure identities, you know, in fact, I've just read finally Sai Deepak's book, The India That Is Bharat, and he is particularly deployed the Latin American decolonial thought to say that how in India decolonizing has to be to go back to that pure Indian Hindu essence. You know, and therefore he says that we have the right to fix our cutoff date. You have fixed 1492, for us it's the 8th century. Now, the danger, I think, is a greater danger is there, you know, in this unifying project, that you kind of leave out an entire history of symbiosis, of living together, you know, so So I think in that sense, one would rather have a fragmented, diverse, multipolar world than, than have this drive towards purity of essences. And I think that is why, while the decolonial thought itself being so radical in Latin America has been deployed by SciDeeper for a very exclusionist project, and you know that Walter Mignolo wrote a introduction to it.
A blur.
A blog also.
Blur.
Yeah.
Then it will do after
Yeah.
Saddam.
I want to know your say on the nature of the colonial modernity.
Sorry?
On the nature of the colonial modernity. On the one hand, we see the whole economy of colonization and colonialism built upon slavery or slave labor that has been brought back to the Caribbean regions to build their economy. On the other hand, the colonial modernity has somehow played their role in liberating those people who are suppressed, liberating those people that have been victim of traditional economic practices in India. So those cultural practices are such a system of all these things. Right? So there has been a debate between the main right and the post-colonialists. We have to reimagine and discuss it based on the culture or the historical aspect that we have. What is your take on that? On the nature of colonial modernity? Are you liberating or it is suppressed?
No, you are absolutely right. The Latin American decolonial thought, when it takes race as a major thing and says that race is a product of colonial modernity.
Latin American modernity, coloniality and modernity is a concept part of each other.
Yes, that they are the same. Yeah, that you cannot have modernity without coloniality, and basically that is exactly what
What is your say on that?
my take on that is no. So my take on that is that no, certainly you cannot therefore take wholesale everything and apply it here. So for example, the critique today, for example, actually it's a wonderful question that you put, because that is what many people ask us, that what is happening in Latin America, particularly that decolonial thought, precisely when it talks about this, the colonial modern and the fact that race is a product of this colonial modernity, and which indeed it is. But there's a huge critique of capitalism there, which I think is the kernel. And if you can retain from, undoubtedly, but listen, even colonial modernity in India was not as liberating as we think it was. You just have to see the land relations under the British. In many ways, they continued. Of course, it is true that it was liberatory. It was liberatory for the Dalits, at least, the missionary schools were there, which is how they were. There's no doubt about it. But if you look at basically in terms of the land relations, I mean, I'm not an economist nor a sociologist, but I have in my book mentioned particularly this debate, that it is true that the British undoubtedly colonial modernity in India. Let me go a little back before that. Was there a modernity possible in India without the colonial intervention? Let's go there first. Do you think that it is only the colonialism which actually ushered in modernization and modernity? Was there an indigenous modernity, or was there something happening in India which you can call?
It is the one.
With the rise of the colonial modernity, this thing has been codified. It's reinstated as a caste, caste race. But through the production of knowledge, they can try to deal with that at the same time.
Undoubtedly. And therefore, I always say that you cannot really apply the decolonial model as such here. Also, for example, today, the indigenous assertion in Latin America, the indigenous assertion I repeat myself, the indigenous assertion today, contemporary indigenous assertion in Latin America is deeply anti-capitalist. So if you have the good thing about the decolonial thought in Latin America is that along with the rejection of the colonial imposition in various ways, whether it's through race, whether it's through the codification of also the way labor, exploitation of labor, etc. The fact is that in the decolonial thought undoubtedly, you see, you look at Evo Morales' speeches, and when they talk of a new era, they're talking of even when they're talking about collective ownership of land as it was in the Ayllus, in the Ejidos, in the indigenous times. So it's not like going back to a pure essence, etc. kind of a thing. It is actually going back to the communitarian living, which was there during living in harmony with nature, so rights of nature and so on and so forth. Many of the things which they're bringing out from the indigenous thought, which they're recognizing, in the Latin American decolonial thought, one finds at least that bit. But if you look at, I mean, I'm not talking about the Ambedkarites, I was mainly thinking of a wholesale application of the decolonial thought in India. You cannot do it because religion doesn't, for example, how can you cannot do it. You cannot do it because, particularly because of the caste system, because of the Varna system, which is pre-colonial, which existed before colonial times. Although Sai tries to say that it is a British thing. Let me come to that little story. So the word caste undoubtedly is a Portuguese word. It is true that the word caste, the Portuguese looked at the caste system. There's a caste system in Americas. It was based on color. So there are these casta paintings where you have, on the base of your color, your social status depended on your color. No? So depending on the mix of white, amount of white that you have. No? And there are paintings. It was codified. So when the Portuguese came here and they found more or less a similar codification, the jati, they called it caste, and that's how the word comes.
The simple definition that I want to tell you is, what is the proper exact definition and how is going to demarcate between the post-colonialist and the decolonial? The decolonial that Latin American has propounded upon and the post-colonialism that India had. Which framework that you have just mentioned, the Deepak Sai use the decolonial framework to try to redefine the nature of colonialism in India. And he is redefining the colonialism in a way that even framing the Muslim as a colonizer.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
So are you saying the post-colonial thinkers in India is something different from the decolonial?
The post-colonials actually did not enter into the subaltern at all. Even the subaltern studies left out the caste question. So the post-colonial India has this deep gap, and that is the Dalit critique of the subaltern studies also. They were in conversation with their Latin American subalternists. So the way the indigenous was a category for the Latin American subalternists, caste and gender was never a category in post-colonial discourse in India. Even with the subalterns, gender comes a little later.
What did I tell you, Petlas?
Yes.
Why is it that Ranjit Guha doesn't talk about Ambedkar at all? He doesn't. Look at his corpus also. He doesn't talk about it. Ambedkar was writing history much before Ranjit Guha was writing.
Scholarship who is just trying to reimagine India based on
No, but I was also thinking,
class-
but Saddam, I was also thinking that decolonization, what will be, do you think there is one singular decolonization conception? I don't think so.
They cannot do it.
Look at Marxists, they use the word decolonization, they are talking something else. So, it's also about, I think, we are trying to homogenize at a certain level that there is one strand of decolonization. Somebody might go with scientific, somebody might go against scientific, somebody might go with Dussel. I have critiques of Dussel. I don't go all out with him. So there is not one singular, I for example, I'm not comfortable with the term decolonization itself because it does lead to a lot of problems. So if are we being sensitive to when we are blanketing everything, because we know Pule has a different understanding. He is saying that please, you Britishers, come and open English schools in our villages because these Brahmins have taken over everything. But that is not what Ambedkar is saying.
No, not at all.
So you have two Dalit thinkers in two different centuries, not very separated, and they are looking at the relationship of the Indian whatever with colonialism, but in different So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I understand, and I always say no. I'm also uncomfortable with post-coloniality. What is that? Who is a post-colonial thinker? But I don't know how you look at it. I was thinking, even to you, can religion be modern? I think it can be modern. For a moment, let's think about it.
No, let's think of the category of Christian socialism which they are implementing in Venezuela.
Liberation theology.
Liberation theology, of course. Liberation theology, of course. But in Venezuela, they have got, they are the most sanctioned nation. Okay? They are building the commune system, no? But one of the biggest things which is a part of the Bolivarian process is Christian socialism. Can we think of Christian socialism? Is it possible at all?
But no chat market. So you wanted to say
I was just nothing so serious actually. I just know there is this genre of music called chutney music.
Yeah.
Which is
So
also
the
there
Popo.
in West Indies. And I think they are mainly by descendants of the immigrants.
Yeah.
I was just thinking if there was some insights related to this genre and how
Yeah, it's a very, very, like, look, I mean, I haven't done much study into, I'm actually entering into the Anglophone Caribbean, and my work has been mainly in Latin America, but of course the Sundar Popo and the chutney music, I mean, they've got deep influence on Bollywood music too. I mean, I think Sundar Popo has written songs, I don't remember which ones, but he has written songs for Bollywood. But I think what has happened there is, several cultural manifestations have, so the word that is used is transculturation, that when two cultures come together, it's not really the weaker culture taking over the the dominant culture taking over the weaker culture, but a new product comes out. And I think that is what has happened in the case of the Caribbean Indian diaspora, that really what has come out is a new product. And so for example, you have these taziyas, Jose, in Caribbean. Jose is the Shia Muslims have, during Muharram, they have the Tazia processions. Now in the Caribbean, they have taken a completely different form. So there is no distinction between Shia, Sunni, Hindu, Muslim. So the Jose is everybody's, for example, festival, so to say. So I think what has happened is there's been a huge transformation of, but the remnants of, your people don't speak, what was it called, Bhojpuri, etc. The songs, I think the chutney songs are basically Bhojpuri songs. But I don't exactly know whether there are many more, but Sundar Popo is supposed to be, of course, one of the major exponents of the chutney music. And the idea of chutney comes from this creolization, hybridity, mimicry, and so on and so forth.
anybody else?
Actually, some not so good as any of the questions. Still, I want to ask this. I just feel like testimonies are reductionist in nature. When we talk about, for example, the Dalit photography as such, what are we actually talking about? It's never telling us a generalized context or anything. It's something very personal. This personal thing have thousand different dimensions. For example, it was Urmila Pawar in one of her works talks about, when I talk about the struggles of a Dalit, when it's from a perspective of a Dalit woman as such. She's talking as a Dalit, at the same time she's a Dalit woman.
Yes.
So there are different factors which add up. And secondly, this is my first thought of the question, and second thing was, you talked about a man who belongs to a different faith reading Ramayana. Actually, I understand the solidarity between two religions and how it worked out, but at the same time, the person about is not allowed to touch it. He could read it technically, but not allowed to touch it. So clearly, there is another hierarchy. Maybe we are missing out, and that's what I believe testimony is doing. It doesn't tell us about everything on the reality. Maybe I'm wrong.
No. So this is the whole idea of what a Dalit autobiography, can it be social science? Or is it just empirical? So there's this big debate, about whether Dalit autobiographies are, there's a big debate whether they're literature at all. In fact, they've been said that it's not literature. Numbers, etc. used to keep saying that Dalit autobiography, how can it be literature? So the idea that Sharan Kumar Limbale, etc. say, no, you have to have a different aesthetics. And if you read these books, they're not just simple, the language is simple, but the fact is that, as I said, it's a store of, they're not, they straddle, as I said, history, literature, and that's why it's been called a post-fictional form of literature. So this is a post-fictional form, it's the literariness of a testimonio. What scales, how do you define literariness? So that is exactly what Sharan Kumar Limbale is saying in Towards the Dalit Aesthetics. Jhutan. Now, can you say that Jhutan is not a wonderfully, it's a work of literature. Jhutan of Valmiki can be compared to, so I think to say that Testimonio is reductionist, I think would be to actually have the same scale, like Garcia Marquez has said in his 100 years, in his Nobel speech, that to measure us from a yardstick, which that is Eurocentrism, no? He's talking about Eurocentrism, that you measure us from a yardstick which is yours, makes us even more solitary. And that is what his solitude is. So I think it's the same thing, that that is why I think the idea of not one model but several models coexisting becomes interesting.
With his testimonies, I feel like it goes on with an idea like, I believe what I see, but it's something beyond that. That's what I think. Like, my perspective is not supposed to be right or
No, but there's a big debate on even within social sciences whether Dalit autobiography, whether social science, whether it can be a source for social scientists at all. I can only talk from my point of view because I'm a literature person. So the debates on literariness of the Dalit autobiography have been now abandoned because it's amply clear that here is a genre and the testimonio is a live genre, it is still there, the chronicle. So for example, in Latin America, coming back to my specialization, in Latin America, the boom novel, the magical realism, Garcia Marquez and all these big novels, 100 Years of Solitude, which was then, you had a Salman Rushdie then writing Midnight's Children on the pattern of magical realism, and magical realism becoming the language of the post-colonial world and of the post-colonial novel as such. Testimonio is a contemporary of the boom novel, 60s. 60s. So the point is that the genre here, there were so many books coming in. That is why, and it was all literature. It is a huge genre which in fact is the main genre in Latin America. Many Latin American literature critics feel that actually the novel has never been it's an ancillary genre. It's a European genre. While the chronicle, the testimony, the non-fictional forms are the genres which, whether they can have the complication of a bourgeois novel, that was said even about the Indian novel. They can only be national allegories. Frederick Jameson, who is in fact a Marxist literary critic at that, said that all third world novels are national allegories are not wrong. So, even a third world novel.
Another question.
I had a classification question. So, you mentioned that these books were classified as testimonies. But then it is very interesting that they were classified as testimonies, but they could have been classified as memoirs. Memoirs have existed for a long time. So, why was it chosen?
Yeah, why it was chosen?
And also another question in response to your answer. So when for example, James is saying that all the third world novels are nationalistic novels, maybe it is also because of a certain, like it's the way that the literature, the way that the imagination is working here is in response to the structure that we are replacing. So it's acting as a response. So maybe that's why Caribbean writers are also writing more towards non-fiction because of because of whatever experiences that they have in response to the structures that they are faced with. It could be that.
So the first question, the testimonial could have been memoir, could have been autobiography. What is distinctive about testimonial? One, of course, the major distinctive feature is the mediation, the collaborative part. A testimonial, the main feature, one of the main features is that it is a collaborative project between two individuals. One, a lettered individual, the other, normally an activist who is not, so that's been defined as the major, which is why I was focusing so much on mediation and collaboration in the production of the other texts, which are otherwise autobiographies. And why are even the Dalit autobiographies, which are written why can't they be called memoirs? Or why can't they be just called autobiographies? Why have they been read in India as testimonial? Why has this Latin American genre been, not because of any fashion? One, because of the collaborative nature, which of course is not there in the Dalit, and therefore, of course, as we say, we cannot have the same yardstick everywhere. As we said, the Dalits would not trust a Savarna writer perhaps to tell their story. So it's a different dynamic here altogether. But the fact is that there can be a relationship of solidarity between a Savarna and a Dalit. And that is why somebody like Sharmila, while calling them testimonials, despite the fact that there's the key feature of the Latin American testimonials that it's a mediated. It's not a non-mediated, it's not a direct, it's a mediated text. So that is one reason. So the classification thing, why are they not called memoirs, why are they not called autobiographies? One is that the autobiography, the word autobiography is generally imagined to be an autobiography of a great man variety, great man variety. So even women's autobiography, how many women's autobiography do you know in India? So I think the idea also is that within autobiography, there is this new silent sector which has started writing or telling their stories. So when do we have the first Dalit autobiography of the first Dalit woman autobiography? When do they start coming up? The first translation that we start coming up in 2010 and around that. So there are reasons why those translations start coming up. Because there is a Dalit assertion after the Mandal Masjid, Mandal politics and so on. So 1990 sees a major Dalit assertion. And therefore this need to know the Dalit word, and there are all the translations. Of course you can say that this is also commodification of the Dalit autobiography. It's also I think Rama wants to answer.
I just wanted to clarify a certain point from a generic point, because we belong to the realm of literature. That with memoir, what happens is that memoir is essentially one particular focus, like migration that happens, and that what partition that has happened, and which is generally out of the realm of the histories. Somehow, in my reading, I find memoirs is exactly that. I mean, if you are going to make a classificatory, signages about what they are, autobiography always covers the entire lifespan, and as you very rightly pointed out, I think autobiographies is all about great men, and the whole dominant character somehow gets reflected there. To the testimonials, I think along with just the collaborative nature, I think testimonial, the etymology itself, it is that very idea that it is a testimony. It is what I have lived, the experience which I am sharing from a point of view which is again a very illiterate or a very which is not Eurocentric, which comes out. I think that is where the power of testimonial comes, and that is where I make the distinction between memoirs and autobiographies, which I still feel is kind of a European or Eurocentric projects as opposed to testimonials. I mean, though it is changing, it is shifting definitely, but.
No, I think Rama's very right. The idea of the testimonial is the urgency of having to say something. So you are in exile, you are a guerrilla fighter, and it's basically the official historiography is not telling that. So if the official historiography is not saying it, and that is why they call the people without history, who will tell about the people without history? And that is why.
A very, very idiotic question. So there is a book which is, I think, biography of Lalu Prasad.
So he basically talks to Nalin Verma, this journalist.
Oh, I see.
And it's obviously it's written by Nalin Verma. And we know that Nalin Verma has a soft corner towards that kind of socialist genre of politicians, etc. Now, how do I classify a book of that?
A biography of that person.
It is sold as an autobiography because it's always written in the first person. This is what I was doing in the university, this is what had happened. But obviously, Lalu Yadav would have talked to Nalin Verma, and because that is happening a lot now, also at the other level.
No, that is something which is said about Munshi Rahman Khan and all also. Are they subaltern? Because they became big rice plantation owners and so on and so forth, So, the idea of Testimonio being a subaltern account and whether Lalu Prasad's Testimonio therefore can be classified as a Testimonio or not, but undoubtedly there is something there which makes you think, because it's not the same as, say, Discovery of India or Nehru's work, there is something about this book which you're talking about which makes it different. So for example, a Testimonio can also be, it's now, for example, a long interview with a guerrilla activist. A book-length interview with a guerrilla activist is a Testimonio. Just interview form. So it's taken several forms in terms of the classification. The Testimonio itself has got different forms. It's got a variety of forms, not just this. The idea is that these are accounts which would not be there in the official historiography at all. And here are people who want to tell their stories. Here are people who are telling their stories who would never be protagonists in a novel. For example, in 1930s and 40s in Cuba, there were poets who started writing poems the way the African slave, or African, not slave anymore, the African speaks Spanish. And for the first time you had a new person entering, the Negro had never been entered the high literature. So that is like Rajanand writing the Untouchable also, and so forth, But for the Negro to write himself or tell his own story, if you read the autobiography of a runaway slave, the richness of his life, as a maroon, and the way he talks about the women and how many relationships he had and how he, they danced and etc. I mean, it's actually quite interesting. It's not trivial. It's not generalized at all. So it's a fascinating account of Maharaj.
So we have, I think, our team very good. So we can also chat while having tea. Thank you very much. I think one of the do engage with literature, but I do not think that they engage with literature. So I don't know, all of you were there when Vivek was here. And Vivek ended by saying that now what the work that he had started doing is, he has collected, he said, around 100 or over 100 autobiographies, and we would call them autobiographies because we don't use testimonials as a terminology, because most of those, a lot of them, the Dalit, what we are calling as autobiographies, are basically works which a Dalit has talked to the person and that person has written. So I think that's an area which is very new also to a discipline like sociology, where it has not happened much. So we also have...
No, but for a historian, oral histories.
Yeah.
Oral
But
history
we don't engage
projects.
with even sociologists. That is why I brought in this ethnologist and things. We do not think in that direction. We would limit ourselves that, you remember, I think, Discipline and Punish by Foucault. So, Alan Sheridan's, I think it is Alan Sheridan's translation. And it is generally would be said that his translation was at that point of time considered the most authentic translation, because the words that they would use in French, the meanings would get lost. Now Marx's collected works are being retranslated.
Yes, of course.
It is because it was thought that the Soviets translated it with their own intent, and there is a lot of things in that. So now, if you look at Marcello Musto has written a book called German Ideology, which you sociologists always read, never existed. Marx never wrote a book called German Ideology. And Marcello Musto has a whole book on it, that how all these things were happening. So I think a lot of things are happening.
Ravi, I would just like to actually, sorry, I would just like to say one thing which is in response to you, because I've been thinking about that. Now, it is also true that even several Dalit writers today are writing literature. Ajay Navadia, who's my colleague, I mean, he writes stories and novels, and therefore for the Testimonio undoubtedly has a limitation. Undoubtedly has a limitation. Which is why recently I was reading, and I must talk about it, a book by a Chilean Palestinian writer called Lina Mercado. There is about 5,500,000 Palestinians who live in Chile. One of the biggest Palestinian diasporas in Chile. So this woman has Palestinian grandparents, and so she says that my Palestinianness was always a murmur behind. And so in an interview she was asked, so she has written this book called Becoming Palestine, which is her becoming Palestinian, how she discovered her Palestinian roots, how she went there, and she did it. So she was asked, that unfortunately the English